Good morning. Welcome to Experts.com webinar with our friends from FPA Med. Those are Dr. Charles Saldanha and Dr. Mark Levy. They've been members of Experts.com for quite some time. And I'd like to do a little bit of a brief intro on Drs. Levy and Saldanha. Dr. Levy had attended the Durham University, UK, attended Durham University in the UK and is a graduate of Columbia College, the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, and as well as San Francisco Psychoanalytic Institute in San Francisco. He currently practices clinical and forensic psychiatry. He's licensed. He's a licensed physician and surgeon since 1972 by the state of California, and since 2004 in the state of Hawaii. And Dr. Charles Saldanha, has graduated from Emory University with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and completed his Doctor of Medicine degree at the Duke University School of Medicine. After his internship at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, he completed residency in psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, and a fellowship in forensic psychiatry at Yale University. He is certified in psychiatry with added qualifications in forensic psychiatry by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I took those off of your websites, those brief intros. I'm sure there's a lot that I missed because there are some pretty outstanding qualifications here. Was there anything that I missed, Dr. Levy, that you'd like to add on there?
No, I think you did a good job. Both Charles and I are on the faculty at UCSF in the Department of Psychiatry, where we teach in the Law and Psychiatry Fellowship, because psychiatrists who want to take the board exam in forensic psychiatry have to complete a one-year fellowship after their residency. So that's the probably main academic activity that we're both doing now.
Excellent. And Dr. Saldanha, anything that you would like to add that I left out on your quick intro there?
I think you covered it very nicely.
Excellent. All right. So we've invited, Experts.com has invited these two members of ours to join us today because they've built a really exciting forensic psychiatry practice. Even if you're not practicing forensic psychiatry yourself, I think there are some really great things you can learn as an expert witness about growing and managing your expert practice. So it's always good to learn from others in other disciplines, and so that's why we've brought them here today. And I've worked with Mark at least since I've been with Experts.com, which is since 2010. So
Right.
We've been in a business relationship since 2010. We've done several things together. But Mark, maybe you could give us. Tell us a little bit about the history of your organization of FPA Med, and I will let you roll on that for a minute or so.
Sure, and interrupt me because I can get too loquacious. I had done some forensic psychiatric consulting starting in the 80s because I'm old, so I go way back. And in the 90s, the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology for the first time offered board certification in forensic psychiatry, which I did in the late 90s. And then for a variety of reasons, both personal and professional, converted my practice from a full-time clinical outpatient psychiatric practice and psychoanalytic to increasingly to a forensic practice. I had been on the faculty at UCSF since middle 70s, but became involved in teaching in the fellowship that started, I think, around 2000. And I realized that I was getting an abundance of referrals. I had no idea when I shifted to forensic psychiatric consulting that it was, in fact, a seller's market, that if you're good, if you're qualified and if you have some idea of the interface of law and psychiatry, then the demand was huge in the legal profession for the kinds of expertise that we had. So here I was teaching these really bright, much younger, much quicker brained fellows. And it just, sometimes you realize something's right in front of you, staring you in the face. It seemed like a natural moment to form a group, which I did with about 5 people. Charles was one of them. This is now 2005 or so. We became incorporated in 2006, but it's been well over a decade and a half.
So you did so on the solo practice side, you did that for about 20 years or so, where you were doing it, and then decided to grow.
Right. I was a solo practitioner in psychiatry, did occasional forensic cases, then got certified, then really committed myself, marketed myself a bit, and we'll talk about that. And suddenly I had an abundance of cases, and it seemed like, gee, why don't I like teaching? I have all these bright people who need to get experience. I had the graying hairs at that point, so why not do this together? And that's how we got started.
Yeah, and can you, Charles, please add to that how you guys kind of started the partnership.
Well, one thing I was going to underscore first was that Mark didn't highlight his sort of pre-forensic career, but I think that's important to mention. That I think for Mark, certainly, there's this whole sort of early part of his career where you're building a lot of sort of just robust expertise in the field. Similarly, for me, I've been involved with the practice essentially since finishing training, and we can talk about a little bit about why that being part of an organization was helpful from that perspective. But I think a salient part of that experience is that it's important, and I imagine this is true whether you're a psychiatrist, an orthopedic surgeon, an engineer, or what have you, that you're building a robust body of experience in the work itself, right? Expertise is something that is cultivated over time, and very few people emerge out of their training experiences, how to, whatever degree program or residency training in our case, as sort of bona fide experts. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Some people do that in the academic realm. Some people do that via really their sort of reputation and practice. But that's just an important thing that I think is part of the history there.
Yeah. And you had how much time were you practicing before you guys decided to partner up, Charles?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually joined Mark straight out of fellowship, and it does highlight one of the advantages. So I had begun my career as a practicing psychiatrist, did that for a couple of years, and then took on gradually, and I've been doing this really ever since, medical leadership roles, which have been helpful to me in certainly learning the craft of psychiatry, but also increasing visibility. And we can talk about how that can even be a source of referrals eventually. But being part of a group was handy. And, Mark talked about his overflow of cases. When you're first starting out, Mark mentioned that a couple of the fellows who joined early on were geographically from the Bay Area, from the UCSF fellowship. I had actually done my fellowship elsewhere, though I had done psychiatry in San Francisco, psychiatry training in San Francisco. So being part of an organization was actually, for me, a very nice way to tap into a stream of cases without actually at that point growing a practice. Mark and I have been partners in growing FPA Med, and Mark may want to talk a little bit more about the trajectory since 2005. But we've been working together as partners for a little over a year now.
Excellent. Mark, yeah, please, because that's, a lot of our members and a lot of early experts and even more mature experts have the solo practice, but in many disciplines, engineering and otherwise, you might see, well, I've got this ability to grow. I'm a mechanical engineer. Maybe I should team up with the electrical engineer, and we offer a more broad set of specialties to a variety of people. So Mark, what kind of led to that?
The partnership with Charles really began as a friendship, even though we're a generation apart, and originally Charles was part of the small coterie of about 5 people, 3 forensic psychiatrists and 2 forensic psychologists who joined me. independent of that, or because of that, or somehow, we became really increasingly close friends, not just colleagues. And I've had two partnerships before Charles in my life. One is my marriage. I met my wife 55 years ago, married 53 years ago, and that's been a great partnership. I briefly had a partnership before forming FPA Med with a psychologist, and it turned out to be a nightmare. So it's really important to choose carefully. In fact, right after that, I was phobic about any partners in my life, and it took a number of years to realize that this would be not just good but wonderful. The partnership that Charles and I have. What became clear was, excuse me a second. We need a cough button. What became clear to me several years ago was, although I love what I do, and I can't imagine what I would do if I retired, because I don't play golf, and I can't travel now because of COVID. It seemed like it was a time to think about succession planning. And initially, I thought that I would sell my practice to one or more of the 5 people who had been with me for 15 years. And it turned out that that really wasn't of interest to them, even though they really liked being part of the group and working for me. Charles had a long talk with me after my failed attempt to pitch the sale. And he may want to go into that. Some of it was explaining to me the generational differences and how that impacts on the decision to buy a practice or not. But thank goodness, sometimes the walls that life throws in your way become actually very good. And this wall was a good one because it led to rethinking this entirely along the lines of growing the practice, making it more of a national practice, really with the goal of becoming the go-to forensic psychiatric and psychological consulting practice in the country. That's ambitious, maybe grandiose, but that's our goal. And slowly but carefully, we're getting there. So Charles was the natural person to be not simply my partner, but the future of the practice. And
Excellent.
That's how it evolved.
Excellent. And we have, I see that the questions are coming in, and please, I love that those are coming in. We'll try to get to them. So if they pop in while we're talking, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll get to them about 11:45, between 11:45 and 12. But if they come in that way, I am going to guide this one, although we're going to get to it a little bit more. Somebody does ask, Kim asks whether you have a criminal or a civil practice. And I think we're going to get into that a little bit later in one of our other kind of pre-prepared questions. But let's talk about, because you guys you've grown now, you've got a pretty significant practice, and maybe Charles, you can speak on this a little bit. What avenue, and you guys have gotten really into some of the stuff that I like to spend some time on in the content creation and things like that. But can we address, and I'll start with Charles, some of those avenues that you use to bring in new work and bring in cases, essentially?
Yeah, I'll start, just so I don't forget, with the lowest tech one, which is that you do work, and if you do it well, word of mouth is a very powerful source of repeat business. So that remains an important source of work. And I just think that's important to say, because that's ultimately the quality of what you do is going to determine whether people call you back, whether you're able to grow that practice. You mentioned content creation. For many years now, we've had a website, and that's been an important place for us to be able to sort of not only show who we are, but also to post content. And that ranges from sometimes we also have a mailing list, so we'll send out a newsletter, but then we'll post that content also to the website. When members of our group do presentations, just recently, one of our members presented on the topic of psychopathy in public figures. And you might guess about whom he was presenting on. He was somewhat telegraphic about that. But long story short, that sort of content can be very useful for showing that not only the intrigue of that particular topic, but it's an opportunity to show yourself presenting. And that's a huge part of what we do as experts, written, of course, and also verbal and spoken communication. So that's useful content and a useful vehicle for displaying it.
In displaying your expertise.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it's a great way to display your and just just the other avenues that you use to develop business.
Yeah, we also reach out to attorney groups. That's been a very fertile source of referrals. Sometimes law firms will have a CLE department, and if you're able to connect with the director of their educational services, they're often quite hungry to have presentations for their associates and partners. And certainly local bar associations as well are often interested in populating their CLE calendar. And I'll mention that whereas we would have gone live to do these things in the past, some of our recent presentations have been virtual, much like this. So I wouldn't say it's easier, but there's a real hunger to develop content that actually you don't need to be getting on a plane to go to North Carolina to do it. You can do it from California or wherever you happen to be sitting.
Excellent.
Mark, do you have some other things you want to add?
Sure. Yeah, well, just to pick up with some of the things you said. First of all, your first point about you do your job well and word of mouth is really important. There's nothing like that. Nothing is better than that. There's also the flip side. And I, for 10 or more years, have taught the fellows at UCSF on starting a practice and how to water and grow your garden and all that. One of the most important things for early career experts in any specialty to realize is in a deposition, which most experts are afraid of before they get experience with them and or training, you know more about the subject than anyone in the room. And you should feel confident in that regard, but always stick to your subject. Sometimes the deposing attorney will try to draw you out into an adjacent area where you really don't have either the credentials at all or the full credentials. Don't do that. That is like blood in the water with a school of sharks, and you will be devoured. So it's much better to say, even when you realize.
And does this, in doing that, help you to develop the business, Mark, by focusing on this is my specialty and I'm not getting beyond the specialty, right?
It helps develop the business in the sense that I come across as credible, even on the stand. So if I'm asked a question, gee, doctor, why didn't you ask my client such and such? And I didn't. I don't try to finesse it. Well, I asked it kind of indirectly. That's a really bad thing to do. I say, that's a great suggestion, counselor. I wish I had. I didn't think of it at the time. That maintains your credibility. You're a human being. But if you go off finessing answers, you're really looking for trouble. So that's an important part of the other side of the quality of work. There were a couple of other things I wanted to say. Our ultimate skill that we are selling is communication ability. It doesn't matter whether we have a CV as thick as a phone book, for those of us who remember what phone books look like. The issue is, how do you communicate? And in our field, it's communicating really abstract concepts. Yep. It's not communicating like an orthopedic surgeon may have to, with at least an image to show. So we need to know what we're talking about. It's based on a bedrock of clinical competence, as Charles was saying, but communication is everything. And therefore, we used to give live talks to legal organizations, law firms, bar associations, now give virtual talks, but these are auditions, and anyone who's wanting to build a practice should recognize this. This is the best. It's much better than all the passive advertising you can do, in books of directories, if you can actually talk. That's why, Nick, you're offering this opportunity to some of your clients is such a wonderful step up in marketing their skills.
Yeah, damn, we appreciate that. We appreciate that. And it kind of leads into our next topic. Unless you had, it looked like you maybe had something, Charles, that you wanted to book into on that, or.
Well, actually, it does tie in the sense that I was going to mention that, our listings with directories like experts.com are a source of referrals. I mean, every week we're getting referrals from that stream as well. So I think the take home there would be that it's not one thing. I mean, it doesn't have to be everything, but in our case, it's been useful to really use a multi-pronged approach. And that's allowed us to outreach to a diverse set of groups, not just the people you've already worked with, perhaps expanding geographically, right? Reaching out to a bar association in an area that you'd like to get some work in, and you maybe recognize there's a need. You need to let them know that you exist and let them know that you can do the job.
It's usually when I give a presentation, and this is not mine, but when I give that, I ask what offline, I'm with the online business for marketing your expertise, but what are your offline avenues? What are you doing there as well? Because it is, and I'm glad you said it, a multi-pronged approach. And speaking of that, this does kind of head into our next of some of those, and maybe we did cover these. How do you market your practice? You're with us, you've got your YouTube channels, you're doing these presentations. Is there anything else that maybe we didn't cover that you're doing to market your practice?
Well, I'll add one more thing, which is that I suspect many of us, regardless of the field we're in, we're part of a subset, in our case, of psychiatrists who are interested in doing this work at the interface with law. So let your colleagues know who maybe aren't quite as interested in wading into those waters. A regular source of referrals for me would be other folks who have worked in the public psychiatry realm who just don't do this work as expert witnesses. But people see them online, meaning attorneys see them online, reach out to them and they say, I don't do this, but call Charles. And that's, again, a really good way to sort of spread a wider net. People may be looking essentially for someone like you, but that person, that they first called just doesn't do expert witness work.
I would just add, as a bookend, the way you categorized it, Nick, that in general, I view our marketing as passive and active. This being an example and the current lead example of active marketing. The passive is listings in online directories of experts, and one needs to find out which are the ones that have the most use by the legal community you're trying to reach, and print directories, which I'm not sure, even though we've been in a number of them for years, I'm not sure that there's sufficient bang for the buck. We're kind of studying that right now. What used to be, I was a bit of a geek and had a website in the mid 90s, and the decision makers in law firms at that point, who were a generation older than me, were not computer literate, and it was only gradually that their associates or paralegals started looking online. That's all changed now. I mean, virtually everyone who calls me has been to our website. Either they got there through Google, they got there through one of the online directories, they got there occasionally from a print directory, but they've been to our website, even if it's momentarily. And for us, that's a big selling point. We are one of only, as far as we know, two groups of multi-person forensic psychiatric and psychological experts. And that affords us certain opportunities, but one of the features of that is we've got a very not only broad but deep bench, because all the 11 psychiatrists are not only forensic psychiatry boarded and trained, but have other subspecialties. 2 are child and adolescent psychiatrists, 3 are addiction and substance abuse experts. Others have other subspecialty. We have someone at Stanford who's a brain injury expert. He's a neuropsychiatrist with a PhD as well as his MD, and the PhD is in neuroscience. So being a group, and this would apply whether you're a group of accountants or a group of engineers, you can broaden and deepen your bench, and it makes you such a better choice for a prospective client, because when someone calls me, my job is not to get that case for me, which I may be reasonably good at or even marginally good at, but I know how to bone up. It's find the best person for this client, and they'll come back, and they'll come back. You know, if it's a child case, they'll come back with an adult case subsequently for us. So
yeah. One thing I wanted to mention is just in terms of, you know, that multi-pronged approach and Mark's comment about studying what's going on. Ask how people found you. I mean,
Yes.
that's something I forget to do, but it does help. I mean, certainly with Experts.com, you may get something directly from the website that tells you. That's obvious. But sometimes the phone just rings, right? And most of us want to get into the meat of the case and actually understand what's going on. But take 5 seconds to ask, how'd you find us? And it's worth noting that, and potentially, if it's some particular source, reaching out to that person and thanking them, and so forth, because you certainly want to keep those channels open and try to do what's working, more of what's working, or figure out a different strategy. If you're figuring out, you know, we've had this print ad for the last 3 years, and we've gotten exactly 1 call as a result of that. You know, you might want to reconsider whether that's the best use of your advertising budget.
And this is one of those things where we knew so many of our members weren't asking that question that you were to ask, where did you find me? So we started tracking the visitors to their profiles so we can show you, here's who did it, who called you. Oh, okay, now I can see, because it's an important question to ask. You want to keep the avenues that are working. And Mark was going into kind of into our next topic, as it were, with the talk of the subspecialties, essentially. But it sort of starts here and answers Kim's original question of do you do criminal and civil and so forth. But a lot of people start out, a lot of forensic psychologists and forensic psychiatrists start out on court referral lists. You know, who do we contact when we need a competency evaluation done? Are you guys still doing that in your practice?
Do you want to pick that up, Charles? Or
Sure. So we as a practice are not on any court referral lists at present. That to some degree has to do with the economics of those evaluations in California. I say that because this may be true in other areas, but they are very low yield in terms of remuneration for the work that's required to do a high quality job. So that's not something that we're currently doing. I do want to say, though, that those types of experiences are highly valuable, particularly when you're starting out. I mean, every time you do a case and you testify, you meet a judge and 2 attorneys at the very least, right? And you're starting to build certainly a presence and a reputation, but also some muscle memory, right? That the first time you go in court, of course, it's a little bit anxiety provoking, or a lot anxiety provoking, and being able to sort of navigate those waters and having been there and done that is really helpful. It's something that attorneys will often ask you, right, when they're vetting you for a particular case, particularly a bigger case, is what is your testifying experience? And it's nice to be able to say, well, I've testified in, over 20 hearings. That's extremely helpful for them to be able to hear, along with, of course, how you're presenting yourself on the phone or the video conference or what have you. So I would certainly, though we're not doing that at present, I would certainly consider that as a way of building, getting some reps in, so to speak, and then building your professional reputation in your community. I don't know if similar things exist in other disciplines, but as you said, Dick, that's a very common point of entry for people in the behavioral health fields.
And although they don't generally happen in a lot of other fields, sometimes your local bar association or your local court will have a list of potential experts that you can get on. So it's not the same as court appointed for an examination or something like that for a psychiatrist or psychologist, but if it's in your backyard, it's definitely worth trying to be on that, in case that's what some attorneys go to still, is
I
who's
know
on
you're
the
supposed to be
court
asking the
appointed.
questions, but is that still a resource that folks go to, the local bar association?
Most everybody starts online these days, at least my generation, they almost all start online. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still attorneys out there practicing who might look at that document if it's available. And at least you can say, well, I'm on this list if that comes up. But that is an excellent point. It is how you started. Do you guys do criminal at this point, or is it predominantly civil practice, Mark?
Well, I personally do exclusively civil,
Okay.
and that's in part because that's what I like, and that's where my experience developed. I think I'll answer your question, but I think that's an important point. There is enough and sometimes huge demand for high quality expert opinion. COVID notwithstanding, with courts closed, that's going to end, and hopefully Dr. Fauci tells us we'll have a vaccine early next year. But once the courts reopen, there's a huge demand if you're good at what you do. So do what you like. And we have people in our group whose whole purpose for becoming forensic psychiatrists were to work in criminal forensic psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
That's what turns them on. That's what you should do. And if you don't like civil cases, if you find them boring or overwhelming or whatever, don't do them. And vice versa. We have because we have 15 experts now, we do criminal as well as civil, although probably certainly more than half and maybe 2/3 are civil. And that's really just the way things have developed. There's no reason for that. I know other people who have a predominantly criminal forensic practice. The problem, as Charles said, is once you do get your chops, unless you can get private criminal defense cases, the compensation is poor. Public defenders or publicly funded criminal attorneys, either the DA's office or the public defender's office, have limited budgets and occasionally have high profile cases where they will go to whatever the market rate is to get the best people available, but generally they don't. So that's a reason for it being on a court list, to meet the criminal defense bar and meet the DAs and become known to them, so that when they do get a private case, they may think of you. And also go to the criminal defense organization, National NCDL, I think. I'm not sure exactly the initials, but offer them a CLE course. Offer them, because all of these organizations are trying to meet one of their members' needs, which is continuing legal education, and they need content. They're not content producers, except in some very narrow legal areas. And any expert would fit somewhere into the sections of the bar and the definition of what constitutes content. So, as Charles said, you need to find out at a bar association or at a legal professional organization, plaintiff or defense side of the civil bar, who is in charge of programming. That will be a rotating chairmanship, and reach out to that person and offer your services.
And we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left for some of our questions. Charles and Mark, we all laughed. We knew we had too many questions that we had developed that we were going to get through. So I want to touch on some of the managing, more of the managing your practice questions before we start taking some questions from, and they're just rolling in. We got a ton of them coming in. So I know everybody's interested to kind of get some Q&A, and we will get there shortly. But this is always an issue, the kind of the back office stuff for experts, right? If you're a small and solo practitioner. So just kind of more on the management side. Do you have staff members who take care of the billing and the invoicing and accounting? And has that helped you in growing the practice?
Yes, I'll take the lead with this. Right now, we have a financial administrator, basically a bookkeeper, but she does more. She handles contracts as well. We have a superb paralegal who we found 7 or 8 years ago, who whose main task is gathering the records, rebate stamping them, because in our field, they come from multiple sources and they all start with 0000, putting them in chronological order and summarizing them for us in a way that we have taught her how to summarize, which is to not interpret them, just summarize them. And so we get a product from her of a roadmap, because we had a case this past year with 35,000 pages of records. And first of all, nobody wants to pay our hourly fees to be reading 35,000 pages of records. And it's overwhelming task. I mean, you would do nothing else for a number of months, just reading those. So this becomes a roadmap. Even if it's a 100 or 200 page summary and chronology, it's a roadmap. So that's very important. Those are our 2 main staffing positions. We are at a point where we may need someone who is a general administrator, answers the phone. That's a trade-off, because answering the phone yourself allows you to immediately talk about the case with the inquiring attorney. And that is an important element of converting an inquiry into a client, rather than I'll have Dr. So-and-so call you back later, or let's set up a time. So we've been on the fence about that. But however, let me just say one last thing, and then I will certainly turn it back to you. One of the benefits of forming a group, and there's no limitation to anyone forming a group, even if you're early in this, form a group with some other colleagues who are early in it, is that you have pooled resources and you can afford more marketing than you can as an individual. Many people initially do their own billing, but you'll find that that's not the best use of your time after you get to a certain volume of work. So you at least need a bookkeeper. Bookkeepers are not expensive. They're virtual. You don't need to have someone coming into your real estate to do it. But you need somebody who you can train on this particular application of billing with providing legal services. So I would urge people to combine if they can, to definitely not overburden yourself with costs when your revenue is thin. Do it stepwise. Don't outgrow yourself, because that's a great way to sink your business, is to overspend.
Yeah, and you talked about one of those things where why we have members of Experts.com involve other members when the case requires more than one. And Charles, did you have something there on the kind of internal management? It looked like you had a couple of items you wanted to cover.
Mark covered most of it. I think what I was going to add was just underscoring that aside from even the pragmatic side, at some point it is nice to not be dealing with why we do this work is not the invoicing and following paper around in that sort of way. And I also did want to add that in both cases, it's been really critical to find the right person. With a bookkeeper, I mean, it goes without saying, you need that person to be honest and clear and timely and all of those things that you would want. And it's not just any paralegal, right, that could do what the paralegal we work with is able to. And I think just pointing that out, that this isn't, you really have to sort of vet these folks very carefully to make sure you're in good company when you're tasking them with things.
Excellent. And along with that, this is something that a lot of experts don't do, but just retainer agreement, not the agreement itself, but how are you communicating that to the lawyers? Are you guys doing DocuSign? Have you automated some of this? are you forcing them to come into the office and sign the old form retainer agreement, or have you modernized that, Charles?
So we do use electronic transmission of documents. We actually are going to adopt DocuSign. I think that's a very sensible thing to do, and just literally with all we've been doing in the practice, haven't taken that step, but that's something that's very much in our radar. But on the global level, I think your question just calls that out, that it's important to have an engagement agreement. That in fact, many of my non-forensically trained colleagues who have waded in these waters, one of the reasons they hopped out is just the kind of madness that can break out around things as important as getting paid, but also what even things like about what you're going to do and when you're available and so on and so forth, because of the lack of an agreement. And
Right.
we're very clear in our agreement about when we're actually fully retained, what the expectations are in terms of timeliness of payment, and what different services are going to cost. We basically bill by the hour, but it's nice to have that understood right up front so that you can then focus on the work in the case. Now, does the engagement agreement completely prevent any sort of shenanigans down the road? Of course not. I mean, there's things that come up from time to time, but I think having a comprehensive engagement agreement that contemplates things like payment is important.
Excellent.
I would just, if I just may add
Sure.
quickly, a very important question for an early career person to learn is ask the question of yourself and then of who's contacting you, for whom am I working? Because it is not always clear, and that can lead you way off course. And in that department, we have a policy of not accepting any assignments from parties to litigation, even if they are pro se litigants. We feel that it's important both ethically and for business reasons to have attorney-client relationship and control between us and the case, and that's all lost with a pro se litigant. Also, it's not uncommon for pro se litigants to be vexatious litigants who have been through 3, 4, 5 attorneys already and are now pro se because the attorneys for whom it's difficult to drop a client,
Yes.
have gotten out of those cases because they're dealing with such problematic personalities and they can't manage them. So that's a really important early career admonition, is avoid pro se cases if you can.
And I'll just add to that we have been fairly insistent on being retained by the attorney, that the agreement is executed by the attorney. Sometimes the attorney will be, yes, of course, yes, we're working together, but often for reasons of not wanting to be on the hook for the funds, is having their client sign off. We've generally not been comfortable with that.
Yeah. And for those who are just listening, you didn't see that I was giving these guys the 2 thumbs up for making sure that the attorney is responsible. I think it's very important. You don't want to have to go after the client to collect later on. You want the law firm. I want to touch one last thing before we get into the questions that just keep coming in. And so for those who have great questions for Charles and Mark, please ask them in the Q&A. We're just about to get there, but I want to touch one last thing on, you guys have sort of, with all your subspecialties of psychiatry and psychology and child and adult and geriatric and wide variety, you have a very specialized area of practice that maybe many people who are here in a variety of different disciplines would be really interested in hearing about, and that's the multi-district litigation. You guys have done, for lack of a better term, or quick law school 101 for those who aren't familiar. Multi-district litigation is a much more common, semi-similar to a class action. That's the best kind of me breaking it down into layman's terms. It's not a class action. There are some similarities, but it's multi-jurisdiction essentially. You guys got involved with these and have kind of carved out a pretty cool specialty for your company here. And I'll start with Charles, and then we'll start with Mark and then hit with Charles. But how did you go about gaining this kind of specialty and then getting those types of clients that are doing this type of work?
Well, like most many things in life, we stumbled into it. In 2002, 2003, I was called by an attorney in Orange County to work on a case where there was a train collision between a commuter train, Metrolink, and BNSF Railways. A runaway freight train had hit a parked commuter train in a station. There were a couple of deaths, hundreds of injuries. And I think I was called, I don't know this for sure, as one of numerous experts that they were calling, not even all behavioral medicine experts, but certainly plenty. As you would expect in any multi-plaintiff catastrophe, there's dozens of PTSD claims. That's the easiest claim to make. It's often inappropriate, sometimes is highly appropriate. And so I ended up going down to Orange County for a couple of weeks at a time, doing series of evaluations. I came down with a psychologist. This is before we were an entity, and that got me into it. After we formed our group, a number of other cases came along. A Xerox shooting by a Xerox repair technician in Honolulu. That's when I got my Hawaii license, actually. And I spent 2 weeks in Hawaii, doing the hard work of being in Hawaii and seeing 35 people. And I realized over time that not only is this an unusual activity for a solo forensic psychiatrist or psychologist to get pulled into, it's very interesting and it has its own dynamics. As we grew, we became a natural for this kind of, so we pitched it in our various marketing efforts. And now we're one of two groups. And so if someone has a multi-plaintiff litigation case, which, as you said correctly, is not necessarily a class action, can be, but it's frequently individual lawsuits that have been aggregated, often by an administrative law judge, into a single case because there's a single related cause. People come to us now, and we are reaching out increasingly to market ourselves. This is yet another advantage of becoming a multi-person group, and that you have access to interesting and very lucrative. Saying that, though, let me just add,
and
they're not easy.
Let me
to
add
land.
there, Mark, just 1 second, if you won't.
Sure.
There's also the benefit of the larger group appearing to have greater capacity to take on something that's much larger.
Yes, that definitely. Just having more hands on deck makes it something that we can do. For example, we've just talked to somebody in another state who has had 18 carbon monoxide cases that he had to do himself. It almost killed him doing it. It did nothing else for months. And that's the kind of thing that we could walk into with efficiencies of time, scale, cost, and do a good job with. And so it's a real advantage. What I was going to say, though, is it's difficult to land these cases because they're large and they have in aggregate high value. You're vetted very carefully. Once you do land them, the biggest problem is logistics, because getting 18 or 1,800 plaintiffs to be evaluated is like turning an aircraft carrier. It's a really difficult, and you need help with that. And that becomes a further task in the process.
Great. Charles, do you have anything to add on those,
No, I
getting
think
those
Mark
big cases?
covered it very well. The one thing I wanted to piggyback on was actually your comment, Nick, about appearing to have depth. There's also this reality, and set aside even the multiple plaintiff cases, that when you're a one-person show, it's there's times where you're too busy or whatever. You've planned a vacation for when the trial is, and it's nice to not have to say no, or you could try these other folks and instead be able to take the case on and have hopefully the person with the right expertise and the right availability on hand to do the case.
That's great. Mark, it looks like you may have accidentally shut off your video.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. And now we'll run into some questions from the group. Guys, thanks so much for that. I know we've got a few hundred people here ready to get in on the questions. So we'll start with Susie asks a question. She says, do you have non-mental health experts who review, summarize records, write reports? And I think, Mark, you kind of covered that with your staff person.
Yes. Yeah, we have this paralegal who does. She doesn't write reports. That's a different matter. An expert opinion is conveyed in an expert report, and then frequently in testimony, at least in deposition. Only a small percent of cases, civil cases, go to trial. So we have someone who reviews records for us, and then we look at these summaries and then drill down into the underlying records in areas that we think are critical for us to have looked at wholly independently of the summary.
Yeah, anybody who is in a medical field knows there's definitely a wheat and chaff problem in medical records, right? That you can have literally tomes of billing records that may actually be worth somebody combing through to make sure that you aren't seeing a change in a diagnostic code that actually implies some different diagnosis, but actually having somebody available who we don't consider an expert in the sense of she's not an expert witness in our group, but somebody who can really fastidiously go through that and extract the information. And just to underscore that, we have our paralegals summarize, not interpret these records. Frequently, attorneys will want to send you summaries of records. Frequently, those are interpreted, and that's problematic for a whole host of reasons. It's not generally an objective view of the records. And just also to underscore a point that Mark made, when our paralegal generates these summaries, they're meticulously cross-referenced with the actual documents. So any document that has something of high importance, we're going to review that directly, but it allows us to have a map of the territory so that we can then go in and zoom in and really focus on the higher yield documents. Yes.
Excellent. Marty asks, and for everybody who's here, we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. Please forgive us if we miss one of yours. There's just a ton of them here. Marty asks, can you share how you viewed the value of the business when you thought about selling it? This is for Mark.
It's an interesting and short answer. I went to the trouble of getting a referral from my accountant to a business valuation expert. Does this for tax purposes, divorce purposes, all kinds of reasons. Has been doing it for decades. And he did a very elaborate multi-tracked analyses. Various kinds of discounted cash flows, EBITDA analyses, etc. And he came up with a value. And that also involves, depending on the field you're in, looking at national standards for a particular kind of expertise that the business conveys. And what it worked out to was about 2 times gross income. I have a relationship with the person who has the other multi-plaintiff, multi expert group in our country,
Hmm.
and he had done something similar, and it worked out to about 2 times gross income in his practice. So I know from my accountant that accountancy firms, which are often valued for various reasons, buying partnership interest or selling them, are 1 to 2 times gross income. So depending on what your field is, there's probably a rule of thumb standard that can save you thousands of dollars in valuation unless you need it, to defend in an audit or something like that.
Right, right. This one, certainly, this is Brooks asks a question, which is not an uncommon question for experts. He's always been reluctant to post content because it's so easy to quote it out of context. This is a particular concern because about half of his clients are represent systems providers, and the other half represent clients of system providers. So you guys create a heck of a lot of content. Certainly in the last couple of years, it seems like even more. You've got the newsletter. How do you address that being taken out of context or somehow being used against you down the line?
Well, I'll just start by saying that it's a very reasonable concern, and you do want to be very mindful of what you post up there, and certainly not reach into any kind of fringe or how to say. Sometimes it can be tempting in trying to render something for a lay audience to stray into pop science of sorts or what have you. So. I think the question is very well aimed, and I think Mark and I are very thoughtful in vetting whatever content's going to end up on the website. It also, in our case of being a group, it really is important, if you do affiliate yourself with other folks, that you think carefully about who that is, right? That these are folks of high integrity, of genuine expertise, who are not drifting outside of their areas of expertise. So that, of course, if you bring somebody in your practice who has a large either body of publications or online presence of their own for one reason or another, in some ways your practice is going to be living with that. So it's not there is certainly the possibility of risk there, but I think you do have to be thoughtful in generating and, of course, then vetting any content. And you'll get offers for people to link to their site and so forth. You got to think very carefully about that sort of thing as well.
And I often will counsel our customers. I'm sure Mark and I have had this discussion many times over the years, but the marketing versus the academic. How is your expertise applied in a certain situation without disclosing confidential information? That way it's more marketing material, but you're removing that confidential. And sometimes that marketing material is much better for the lawyer who is the layperson when it comes to your area of expertise, right? So you can bring it to, and even a disclaimer can also work on these, that look, this is we're using a hypothetical for this particular purpose. And then having, I'm sure you guys have had the question asked in deposition, in which case you have an answer for that piece of content, right? Well, in that I was using that as a hypothetical, or some reason, there's a reason I was using that, and those facts differ from the facts in this case because of, and so forth. Does that sound about right, Charles?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think attorneys are naturally going to use what's available to them. If you, well, just take publications. If you don't have publications, they'll say, well, how come you haven't published in this area, have you? Well, if you have published in the area, well, this is what you said in this area in this article. So there's a little bit of a darned if you do, darned if you don't kind of issue there. But I think you, like you said, have to be prepared to sort of explain why a particular set of statements or maybe even a previous deposition involved a different scenario and why this is not applicable in this scenario. Mark, did you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think you've covered correctly that the longer you do this, the more history you have that is potentially going to be thrown in your face, whether that consists of articles, whether that consists of your other testimony, because both sides of the civil bar maintain lists of experts and gather as many depositions as they can, so they can say, 3 years ago in Tallahassee you said this and now you're saying that. And you need to be, if that happens in a deposition or even more so on the stand, you need to say, let me look at what you're quoting from. And that buys you time. You refresh your memory about that case, at least the context in which that taken out of context, which it always will be, statement is, and you usually can explain why that was different. There's always the refrain, if the facts were different, I'd have different opinions potentially. So you always can defend yourself in that. But I think you just have to take it with the territory that you will, the more you're in this field, the more you'll be confronted with things you've said. And that's why it's so important always to guard your integrity, to call it as you see it. Don't get in the situation of being a hired opinion. You've got to be able to defend no matter how much you're being paid or no matter how much pressure is put on you by retaining counsel. You got to be able to defend the opinions that you're going to put out in public.
And good attorneys want that. They want to know what you actually think. I mean,
exactly.
If you're giving them something that isn't a well-founded evidence-based opinion, it's not going to hold up in the adversarial process. A close cousin to what the question was about is also people's social online presence. I remember maybe about a decade ago at our professional meeting, the Forensic Psychiatry meeting, there was still a prevailing sentiment that forensic psychiatrists just shouldn't have online presences. I think, in 2020, increasingly, even if it's just LinkedIn or, people have some sort of online footprint. That being said, if you do choose to have, social media accounts, it's really important that content is also carefully curated.
Yes.
One other thing, if I may add.
Please.
It's one thing to control what you voluntarily put on your site, but as you get larger, you may purchase SEO, search engine optimization services in order to make your site organically higher on Google searches. Be very careful because search engine optimization firms will try to create backlinks, and backlinks raise your profile in the order in which you come up in an organic search, but they may be backlinks that you don't want on your site to flaky periodicals or online periodicals, etc. So you got to, we just learned this. You've got to really be conscious of what the SEO consultant is doing and vet to whom they are trying to link you, because it's much better to have no links than to have bad links.
Many horror stories about this. Kim asks, actually, there was another one that kind of ran into that I think we were kind of covering. One second, I'm asking them a little bit out of order that they came in because some of them run right into, are you still expanding your practice, and which geographical locations are you looking at?
So Mark and I have decided to take, so the answer is yes, we are still expanding the practice, and geographically, we're not necessarily focused on one particular market. In fact, probably the most important dimension of expansion is the quality of the expert, and not, I don't just mean to describe their CV, but we're really interested in having folks join the group who are high integrity folks, first of all, who are colleagues that we'd like to work with. That's been, we didn't really talk about that much, but one of the huge benefits of the group has been a source of colleagues and collegial and even personal support in a field that can be rather isolating, right? You're often sort of on your own reviewing records. Most of the work is pretty insular. And we've been able to certainly draw on one another for certainly professional type of consultation. But boy, it's also nice to just talk through how things are going and so forth. So that's a rich part of what we've had as a group. And as we grow, we're mindful that there's challenges in maintaining that that feel, but we really find that extremely important to do that. So, you know, in terms of geography, we've been based in the San Francisco Bay Area essentially since our founding. We've done cases all over the US. We would certainly be interested in having a presence, but again, with the right person in geographically distant markets, be it in the Midwest, East Coast, Southeast, and so forth. Yeah.
Right.
And we have now we have a presence in the Southeast, in the Midwest, in Nevada. So but as you said, more important than the location is the quality of the person. However, what we found also is secondary locations can be an interesting way of building a practice if you find the right person, obviously, because they have far less competition in a secondary city. So, you know, there may be a much larger legal community in Los Angeles or Chicago, but somebody in a secondary city may be the only game in town and have a really productive network for referrals. And so that's a balancing factor when choosing to team up with someone in another location.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really great information. Sandra asks, and I may be getting this question a little wrong here, so you may clarify, Sandra. Since COVID, with many or most attorneys working remotely and maybe not answering their phones as much, have you changed any marketing activities? Now, I'm not sure that phone calls to attorneys is necessarily the best use of your time, unless it's somebody you've already got an existing relationship with. But have you changed your marketing at all during COVID?
Mark, do you want to take a crack at that first?
Sure. Well, yes and no. We've done more marketing during COVID on the theory that when things are slower, which they were, they're now picking up. Is a good time to do more marketing, not less. We've focused it more on online marketing. We've wholly switched to webinar and online presentations such as this, whereas we did some of those, but did many more live presentations before. That's just a necessity. And it goes along with actually doing online evaluations and online testifying in hearings, in depositions, and so on. One thing, though, is we don't initiate calls, but as we evolve our marketing and as we become larger, it's very important. No one has said this. It's very important whenever you get a call to keep that person in a contact list, because that's already a selected population of attorneys, whether or not they retained you as a client, that you want to reach out to and be crossing their desk periodically. So what we are thinking about now is even more focused use of our contact lists to go back to people in subcategories, you know, the family lawyers versus the probate lawyers, and direct marketing in their areas rather than a general reaching out to them.
Excellent. And Susie asks, how do you structure payments to your employees or associates? Whatever you guys can share. I certainly don't want you to give too much proprietary here, but you know, there is interest in how, from a management perspective, how do you do that?
I'm happy to answer that. We have a split between the billing rate and the compensation rate to our associates. All of our associates are independent contractors to our firm.
Okay.
The exception being, and that includes our paralegal and our bookkeeping staff. California has had a revision of its independent contracting. It has had a law that was passed, I think, effective maybe the 1st of January 2020, which makes that feasible for physicians, psychologists. It may not be feasible for other kinds of experts. I don't know if the carve out that exists for doctors, being able to use independent contractors without it being categorized as employees, applies to engineers or other professions, but that's what we've done. So we basically have a split, and the split covers a lot of the expenses that we provide. But we're a virtual practice. We're not providing real estate. Everyone, being an independent contractor, has their own malpractice insurance, has their own, covering their own costs. And they're not W-2 employees. They pay their own taxes on the income they receive. They're 1099 employees.
Okay, great. Let's see. Actually, this one's a follow-up here. Somebody sent direct to me. How do you set your advertising marketing budget? Is that a percentage of your annual, or?
Yeah, we haven't been quite that scientific about it. I think it's a kind of a Goldilocks thing, and I think you want to be again, to go back to when we were talking about marketing, we've been trying to have an ongoing sort of analysis, sort of a balancing, if you will. I think of it kind of like portfolio balancing, where we're sort of strategically thinking about first and foremost, not just like any cost, overhead cost, you don't want to be engaging in florid spending that sort of is not sustainable, but also constantly analyzing where we're getting good return on that investment, and and potentially letting go of things that aren't producing the yield we'd be looking for.
We've retained a marketing consultant just recently, specifically for this purpose, because a big category of expense for us is marketing, and it's just not an area that either Charles or I have the knowledge to accurately assess. What are the metrics you want to look at, and which ones are meaningful, and what do they mean? So this person has that expertise, and we've been going through our SEO and other kinds of online. We had pay-per-click advertising on Google. We're going through that, looking at the metrics, and trying to get metrics much more difficult on print advertising, and deciding where is there a bang for the buck and where is it just wasted money. And that expense will offset the consulting expense, we think. Let's save it.
Yeah. And, I'd be just thinking about, I think for most folks, they're actually wanting to see real cases that they or their group are working on, right? So it isn't just clicks, or it isn't just website visits. It's not the inquiry, as happy as you'll be to help, from a high school student interested in learning about forensic psychology, right? So you have to be thoughtful in the marketing about not only how many calls you're getting, but what the nature of those calls are.
Right. And Rob asks, do you use direct mail to your contact list as a marketing strategy? Now, if you do, I'm not on that list, but I am on your email list, your newsletter.
Yeah, we haven't used direct postal mail, but we do, as you mentioned, we do have a newsletter that we don't send out at a set interval, but roughly monthly, and we try and send out something that is, again, broadly interesting content that is at that interface of mental health and law. And it does seem that that's actually yielded it. It's not unusual that after we send one of those, that someone who's opened that then picks up the phone and calls us about a case. So that does seem to be effective. Obviously, it takes some time and energy to generate that content. Someone had asked about budget. There's
Yeah.
also energy and attention that this requires. So I think that's, there's sort of only a limited amount of energy and time you have. So that's something I think everybody's going to have a different comfort level with that. But and I think Mark and my experience, just even the thinking about it, let alone generating the content or doing presentations, it's, a significant chunk of our professional activities.
Sure.
The
Go ahead, Mark.
one thought I would add is if whatever you do for marketing and creating content, make sure the content is practical. Like I think this conference is. We've tried to keep this conference practical, useful information to people about starting or growing their practice. And I think if you put that hat on when you're thinking about your target audience, generally litigating attorneys, what would be helpful for them in managing their cases that draws upon your expertise? That's what should be in a newsletter or a communication or an email.
That's great ideas, great information. I'm looking through here there's been some questions that are just right on point, or nice transition here, and I just lost this one. Emin asks, he's trying to reach out to bar organizations to give talks and can never get anyone to respond back to him. Any recommendations or tips that you can provide there?
Yeah,
I'll just start. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
It's really hard during COVID because everybody's working remotely. The only thing I can suggest, Charles may have a different idea, is persistence.
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
It's just because if you persist, I just got an email back from the San Francisco Bar Association, the new person who's in charge of their continuing legal education. I must have written to her twice. The last time was 3 months ago. And she wrote back apologetically. And this is an organization that I've been connected with since the mid 90s. It's not like I'm a stranger calling, but it's just so difficult. Persist, it'll pay off.
Right.
I just would add, and that goes with inquiries as well, that, it's probably not hard to imagine that other people's desks are like yours, that things are piling up on them. So when someone reaches out to you about a case and you haven't heard back, don't assume the ball's in their court. It's been really, I think attorneys have been genuinely appreciative when we've followed up. Obviously, there's a limit at which point you would be off-puttingly insistent, but following up every month or so is certainly not, I think most attorneys receive that warmly, and they understand that you're an engaged, active expert who will hopefully be similarly responsive as the case is actually going forward.
And we use case management software now. This was something that our size allowed us to afford.
Right.
In which all cases that are opened are either open or pending or closed at a certain point. So we can go weekly through our pending list and send a follow-up if it's been several weeks since we heard back about an initial inquiry to which we responded, but there's been no follow-up.
Excellent.
That's been very good because they fall through the cracks otherwise.
They can very easily. So that having that customer relations is really good. Susie asks, what is the average hourly rate of your experts? I know this is always on, and I'm not sure what you guys want to share here, but this is on every expert's mind as to, am I undervaluing my service, or am I too expensive, so I'm leaving it? Is there some sort of a gauge you guys can give on that, Charles?
Yeah, I'd start by saying that the market is different in different markets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in our conversations with other folks in our field, our rates may be somewhat higher due to our being based in a major metro area, in a particularly expensive one at that, and meaning the San Francisco Bay Area. Our experts range between $600 and $750. There are certainly people in our field who charge significantly less than that. There are also people who charge significantly more than that. Mm-hmm. That's one of those things where it's very difficult to give particular guidance on what correct fees would be in a given market. But I think I would be, asking around locally,
Mhm.
and also just attentive to whether your fee ever seems to be a barrier for people working with you. Sometimes that's okay because you actually don't want to take work that's less well remunerated. But there's if you're sort of getting some sticker shock, obviously that's something to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think that's great guidance because and I tell experts this regularly. If you're a New York-based expert, your hourly rate in New York is going to be significant. If it's a really great case out of Nebraska, you may have to alter those numbers a little bit for a Nebraska venued case.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Nick, because I think this may have come up around the civil, criminal, or the court panel thing. I would not hesitate to discount your rate to do a case you want to do. That's there are cases that are absolutely worth doing at a discounted, even heavily discounted rate, because they're compelling, interesting, and you for whatever reason you want to do the case. So I did say those rates, but we do discount rates for public entities and certainly in other circumstances where for a one reason or another it makes sense to do that.
And I learned the importance of that years ago with a mass tort case coming out of the Department of Justice in Washington, that a fairly senior attorney who was vetting me for this case, for our group for this case, but through me, late in the discussion said, I need to show my boss that I can get a better price for us. And so we discounted it, and it was a done deal because one piece of making this work was for him to be able to say to his boss, look, they usually charge this, they're going to charge us 10% less. So that's another factor in how you price yourself and the negotiations that go on.
Excellent. That's great. And we have a question here. I'm going to go ahead and answer it because Dennis asks, and it looks like it got upvoted as a question others would want to hear from. We've had issues about being disclosed as experts without our knowledge. As a result, all of our CVs are watermarked for consideration only, not retained. This requires the attorney to contact us for a clean copy. He asks your thoughts on this practice. I think it's a great practice. We recommend it. Watermark the CVs, not yet retained, unofficial, something like that allows them to reach out to you, require them to reach out to you. Is everybody seeing, I see there's a question here, how can we contact Mark and Charles? I know we only have a few minutes left. I don't want to hold them over. Is everybody seeing their contact information, phone number, website on the screen share right now? Is that showing for you and Mark, Charles?
It is for me. Yes, I see it.
Okay, great. Excellent. So, and we've got just several more questions here. We got about 7 minutes, folks. So please get in those last minute questions. Trying to, retention agreements has come up. What about retainers? Do you have a standard contract agreement? I see. Do you post your retention agreement on your website? There's a variety of retainer engagement questions here. So it looks like, and it's always a big question in the expert space. So is that something you post on the website? Do you guys have a standard agreement that you share, or is that something you keep specifically for attorneys?
We keep it specifically for attorneys and have felt that we didn't really want our compensation to be in the public venue, in part because we may modify it for a particular case,
Yes.
as we said. So it's anyone who is an attorney who asks for it, we send it freely, but it's not posted on our website. I found it's very important to have an engagement agreement. You're going to be asked your fee schedule anyway, so we have it in one. There are some experts who don't use engagement agreements and rely on a handshake. And I admire that. I was told a long time ago by a very experienced forensic psychiatrist that anyone who doesn't use a contract just hasn't been stiffed yet. Although using a contract doesn't prevent you from being stiffed. It may reduce the incidence of it, but it's no guarantee that you're not going to have a fee dispute. The most important thing
But that
we've
dispute is much more likely to get resolved in your favor if you have it written down. You have a contract.
Okay. That's good to know from someone with your background. We've found usually disputes can be resolved. It's very rare that somebody is just, but the most important thing that we need to do, and we do this now with our practice management software, is to follow what is in our retainer trust account for a particular case, because there's a curve of work, and early on, there's not a lot. And then suddenly there's all the records to review and the examination, the IME, and it may take place within 4 weeks or 5 weeks. And you've blown through your retainer at that point. So we are much more studious now about getting back to the attorney and saying, there's $2,000 left in the retainer. We need it replenished so we don't have to interrupt our workflow on your case, that kind of thing. I think communication is really important in maintaining the flow of payment.
I think that's excellent answer there. The communication and the flow of the payment is really great.
I'd just add one thing.
Yeah, please.
We generally have a non-refundable initial retainer. But again, that's something that we have modified. It's usually a 10-hour retainer. Most of our cases, just given the nature of the work we do, it's the work is going to be that and then some.
Right.
But if for some reason that feels like a barrier and it's an appropriate scenario in which to do it, we will make that refundable, or we will reduce the hours of the initial retainer. So it's nice to have a starting place, but it's helpful in not to send work away for kind of being too wedded to a rigid. Thank you with your agreement.
That's great guidance there. Great advice. A couple of folks have asked, what is the name of the case management software that you guys use?
Clio, CLIO.
Oh my gosh, we did that in stereo.
Wow, you guys have been partners for way too long here.
Just in case it got muddled, Clio, CLIO.
Perfect, and that's
it's actually a
legal,
used by legal practices.
Yeah,
but it suits it as opposed to an electronic health record.
Right.
It matches what we do in our expert practice much more closely than a medical oriented software would.
Great. And it looks like we have time for one more. Sorry, everybody, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we'll take this one. We did touch on a few items for the newly new expert witnesses, but and also I want to stop for a second and let you know that if you wish to join Experts.com, we've now flipped over to that slide. We decided on 2 slides, one for them and one for us. That's how we decided, one for Mark and Charles and one for us. This is how you get in touch with Experts.com. See the discount code there if you wish to join. It's a 25% discount. Use the code FPA. That's Forensic Psychiatric Associates, so FPA 2020. So we know that their smiling faces were the ones who brought in the business for us. But Thea asks, when you were first starting as an expert, what did you find the most difficult to adjust to as an expert, as opposed to being a doctor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll go first, and I'm sure Mark will have other thoughts. I'd say for me, the most significant adjustment was genuinely feeling like an expert. And that may be somewhat of an artifice in our field, because unlike most fields in medicine and probably other areas of endeavor, we have this training in forensic psychiatry. There's actually a fellowship. In fact, now, in order to have boards in forensic psychiatry, unless you were grandfathered in, like Mark, you need to have completed a fellowship. But I dare say that this is true as a practicing doctor as well. You're not a finished product just because you finished your training. So learning to sort of wear that mantle and feel like you're wearing it credibly is something that for me came over time. And I don't know that everybody feels that to the same degree, but it is kind of linking back to that earlier question that you had asked, Nick, about court panels. Get in there and do the work. There's nothing like doing the work to make you feel comfortable. I mean, that was true in my expert witness practice, and it was also true in my clinical practice, working in one of the busiest psychiatric emergency departments in the United States for 2 years. I had some sea legs after that. So you do have to kind of just go and do it, right? If you never go to sea, you'll never go to sea, right? So I just would encourage people to give it a try, work on your skills, practice with people. If you're worried about a deposition, you're worried about doing civil cases because you're worried about doing a deposition, practice with somebody. You may know an attorney, or just even another colleague in your office can probably will probably have a good time putting you through the ringer.
Charles, do you have anything on as well to add to that?
Mark, you mean?
Mark, I'm
Yes.
sorry, Mark.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. Charles did a very good job.
Yeah, very good job.
First of all, if anyone has questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to contact us.
Yes.
Nick can put that up. I absolutely agree with Charles. In addition, what I felt because of the later time in my career when I started this work, that I already felt confident with my expertise. I shared the same experience Charles had when I was first a physician, first a psychiatrist, etc. But what I found difficult was realizing that forensic psychiatric practice is a business. Nobody in medical training says anything or teaches anything about the business of practicing medicine. In part because that goes with the mantle of you're there to alleviate suffering, you take care of people, you do your job well, you'll make a living, you'll be taken care of. It's different when none of your clients are patients looking for suffering relief. They're attorneys looking to win cases and make money doing that. And so, I mean, there are exceptions, obviously, there are pro bono cases, but generally, it's a business for your clients. And it takes a different mindset, a different hat for you as an expert to start thinking about yourself as a business person in a business process. So that was the biggest adjustment for me.
Great. Gentlemen, thanks so much. Any last anything you want to say? We've got some lawyers who were visiting today, other experts who are here. Anything that you offer them? I know we've got, if you want to get in touch with Mark and Charles, you see on the screen here, you can reach out to them at forensics@fpamed.com. Their website is fpamed.com. And if you wish to join, again, here's our contact information with the discount code. Is there anything you guys, any last minute just thoughts from either of you before we wrap up?
Well, perhaps we should have given this disclaimer up front, but I don't think Mark or I consider ourselves as having some, just roadmap to success in this field. It's really, I think, a lot of trial and error. And that's okay. That I think, persistence, right, is really important as well. And I would encourage people to reach out to other colleagues in that area. Maybe somebody who's a bit more senior in the field, who's also an electrical engineer doing expert witness work. Pick their brain too. I think people are generally pretty generous with their advice and time, and wouldn't be shy about taking advantage of that. We're lucky to be part of a a kind of a national guild organization for forensic psychiatry.
Mm.
And that's certainly been my experience in that group, is that people are very generous with their time and expertise.
That's
And
great.
as teachers, we learn from being asked questions all the time. So anyone who's attended this, be they experts or attorneys, if you have any questions, please reach out to us. We're happy to give you a free consultation on a case if you're an attorney with a question about whether you need our expertise, but pick up the phone. We enjoy talking.
That's great. Thank you so much, guys. I'm going to stop the share, so just our beautiful faces are left on for the wrap up here. Thank you, everybody who has joined today. That is it for our Growing and Managing Your Expert Witness Practice. Our guests today were Charles Saldanha, MD, and Mark Levy, MD. You can contact them at fpamed.com. That's their website. And their email is forensics@fpamed.com. Please reach out to them. They've been very helpful here. And if you want to join Experts.com, remember, we've got the FPA discount for 25% off of membership. FPA 2020 is the discount code, FPA 2020. Thanks again, gentlemen. I'm going to stop the recording there, and I will see you later.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.